Welcome to the Tech Prospective Podcast, a show where we feature diverse perspectives from people all across the tech industry landscape. My name is Jelani. I am your host, and I am joined today by a very special guest, friend of the pod, Facebook software engineer and host of the Meetup group, Rust NYC, Robert Balicki. Did I say your last name right?
Oh, yeah. I don't really quibble about how my last name is pronounced. It's pronounced Balicki in Polish, but it's so weird to go from English diction to Polish diction. So like whatever people say is fine.
You say Balicki?
No, I don't. But it's supposed to be said Balicki.
That's actually kind of
but
cool.
To go from English to hi, my name is Robert Balicki. It's hard to keep the rhythm. So Balicki is just fine.
That's a cool pronunciation. You might have to go with that one. That's pretty cool. How are you though?
Good. I'm excited to be here. Excited to chat for a little while.
Yes. So I think like every great story, we should start right at the beginning. So just wanted to get into your background in tech. So how did you really get started in tech? How did you get excited about tech? How did you start pursuing it as a career?
So I've done a little bit of programming throughout my life. I took programming classes in high school, just kind of toyed with it a little bit. And then after college, I took a job doing like market research and basically working in Excel and building stuff in PowerPoint. And Excel has sort of a built-in programming environment. And so I just ended up automating a lot of my tasks on the day-to-day. And that was sort of, I think, what drove me back into programming or like made me more excited about it. And I think at some point in time between high school and post-college, Rails became a thing, all this other stuff became a thing, and suddenly it became a lot easier to do web development. So I started to learn web development on the side, and I ended up just learning it on the side, doing a bunch of hackathons while I still had the energy to, work all night and then go into work the next day and stuff like that. So it was a transition from sort of market analysis.
Oh, wow. So you're self-taught.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Yeah. So.
Wow. Because I saw your degree.
But I majored in, I majored in math and stats. And so stats, there was some programming to it, but it's more like, it's like scripting. It's not like, building big software engineering things. So I had some familiarity with it, but it was mostly to get sort of tasks done. But yeah, like the actual engineering part, I guess you could say I'm self-taught. It seems very overblown, but yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know you were self-taught because as I was looking at your background, I was trying to find out where you transitioned. Because usually like some people there's like, oh, I went to this boot camp or I took these courses or something like that. But with yours, it felt like just a jump from what you were doing prior to then jumping right into an engineering or architect type of role. So what were you doing prior to getting your full first engineering job?
Yeah. Okay. So I was at Staffing Industry Analysts, which is the aforementioned market research company. After that, I quit to attempt to start a business, which about a year and a half in, decided that I probably wasn't the right time to be starting my own business. I wasn't really doing a very good job of the sales and marketing and all the other non-technical stuff. But luckily for me, I was able to move in with my parents and keep them company while I taught myself to program, a lot more than I could have beforehand. So at the end of that, when that was winding down, I started working remotely and traveling. Basically, I would go on Elance and find gigs there. Sorry, not traveling. Then I realized I wasn't tied down, so I did start traveling. And I went to Chicago, then to Boston, and then eventually my plan was to go to New York. When it got cold, go to Texas, although mostly I was just too afraid to go to South America, but I really wanted to go where it's warm in the winter. But I took a full-time job in New York. So I think what really impressed the interviewers was that I had a lot of live projects, and I actually, I was showing off one of them, realized there was a bug, and I was like, hey, give me a second. And I pushed a new change, and they saw the updated code in sort of minutes or whatever. And that was nice. That was really impressive to them. And so I think that's how I scored something that I probably was a little underqualified for, but I didn't complain. So yeah.
That's a pretty cool trick. It would have been cool if you had like planned that. You're like, I'm gonna have this little bug and I'm gonna fix it in front of them.
I'm not that dastardly, but that would be good. Yeah. Yeah.
That's so cool though. So you're self-taught. You end up getting this role now. Now that you're coding is your job. Once you get that first role, what are some of the things that you, like, coming into the gate, you were kind of surprised by working within like the team concept? Because I know you did some hackathons, but now you're full-time, day-to-day working with the team for the first time in coding. Like, what did that feel like?
I think there's a lot more bureaucracy maybe, or just like more process around things. When you're working on your own, it's easy to just work on what feels right or what's the highest impact thing on a day-to-day basis, and just keep in the back of your head the plan, and make the sort of trade-offs that you think are right or not right, or just make you happy. Whereas at my first job, I had to get used to the planning process. And it took longer to convince people to sort of do the right technical thing. Just not to knock on my coworkers or anything. It's just, there's a, institutional inertia anywhere. Actually, one thing that's kind of entertaining is that when I first joined, before I had anything productive to do at this company, I was just looking around the code base and sort of poking around to see like what could I improve and whatnot. And I found that one of the screens was, I think, re-rendering every second, or possibly every screen was re-rendering every second. And this was because there was, after 20 minutes, we showed a modal that, asked you if you wanted to be logged out or something like that. And I looked at this code and I was like, wow, this is poorly written. So I just went ahead and rewrote it. And this sort of like threw me into this morass, which was that this code as far as I remember, didn't really have an owner, didn't really have a correct behavior. And I fixed it a little bit, but then it suddenly fell on me to figure out, hey, what is the correct behavior in this case, which nobody really knew. And it's probably not the most strategic thing to join a company and then find some code that somebody else wrote and just sort of redo it without asking. There's more politic ways to do this, but I was young and I didn't really care. As you can tell, I'm still very young, but less so. And so that fell on my shoulders, and that was funny because it seemed like, hey, I could fix this in a couple hours, and then it ended up being, I think, weeks or whatever of actual work to, the political side to get everyone to agree on what's the correct behavior for this, 20-minute timeout modal.
So you came in kind of hot as the young new coder, and. Mm-hmm. Did you feel like there was a bit of animosity towards you, by some of the more seasoned technical people on the team?
Not on the team. This was code owned by another team, so my team I was just fine with. But yeah, I think so. I think that there were a number of times when I wanted to, not immediately when I joined, but just over the course of my time at that company. Where I tried to push for a new technology, and it was tough there. to do that. And I definitely didn't grok the extent to which like you have to get consensus and, tell people like, hey, we're just going to use this technology maybe in this way, even though it opens up like this Pandora's box of other ways that you could use it. Like on my team, like I intend to use it in a fairly responsible fashion, or convince people that, hey, I'm not just following the latest trends. Like there's actually a reason to do this. And that's definitely something that's a long time. You always need to build consensus.
Yeah.
That's something that I learned over time. Yeah. So I think like when you join, you sort of have a chip on your shoulder. And once you get that chip off, you can take a step back and be like, okay, fine. Okay. Let's build the consensus. I no longer need to be, coming in hot. So
Came in hot. When you start at a company, especially like in the beginning stages of your career, which this seems that situation seemed like, it tends to inform the way that you look for your next opportunity. So how did that, coming from that side of things where it was like you came in hot, they were like, listen, you got to get a consensus here. You can't just move, you can't just move by yourself and make these edits. How did that experience in that organization prime you for how you thought about your next opportunity?
So I think, so that company was fairly large. And the next two places I worked at had small engineering teams. So I think it ended up being easier for me to, build consensus without really building that muscle proactively, or because it was because they were smaller teams. So I think what I realized from that first experience was that, maybe being at a big company wasn't the right move. Also, I think at the time there was a lot of, I drunk the Kool-Aid about how awesome it is to work at startups. I got a lot out of it. And I really enjoyed it, but I was definitely like looking for a hot new startup using the latest tech, using this or that. And so I don't know if that was a reasoned decision or if I sort of was reacting to the fact that I didn't like, well, not that I didn't like, I enjoyed that job a lot, but that I would like the smaller environment more. And so I ended up transitioning to, a couple startups, which, where it is easier to, just sort of rewrite things. There's fewer people that you need to convince. So, and also, so the first place I worked at, the aforementioned big company, is an Angular shop. And I ended up learning React while I was there, I believe, and building a few side projects with React. And while I was interviewing, I definitely sold myself or oversold myself as sort of a React expert or whatever. I mean, expert's the wrong word. It's clearly not the case, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Emphasizing that point in interviews. And companies that are looking to transition from whatever the company was using to React don't necessarily have the experience to judge whether I'm full of smoke or not, or blowing smoke or not.
Right.
Full of myself. I don't know what the phrase is, whether I'm overselling or not. And so I could get away with that. And so that was another way that I positioned myself to be at a company where they were using modern tech. Is that I saw what I wanted to work with. I used it a little bit on the side, and then I talked myself up during these interviews. Yeah.
All that marketing that you've been doing the whole time, it came in handy there.
I do think I've been sort of marketing myself since I got into tech. Not necessarily very successfully, or like with massive results, but like that's been something that I've been aware of. Like I've always made sure to publish stuff onto GitHub. And when I think about like what to publish onto GitHub, especially early on in my career. So at the time, Grunt and Gulp were big. I think Grunt was big, and then Gulp was becoming bigger. These build systems, and I would figure out like what's some little aspect of this build system that isn't available, and then I would build that and publish it as a library. Nothing particularly fancy, nor anything that I would even really recommend other people use, nor with good test coverage or nothing. It's not like high quality code. But I think that I understood that if you go into the build side of things, it looks impressive. It's a little bit less impressive to publish a component library or something like that, unless it's, you have to put in a lot more effort to make a component library look very good on your resume. But if you build like a tiny little tool, it looks like, oh, this person sort of knows what they're talking about up and down the stack, whether or not that's true. And I think that's one thing that I sort of leaned into early on. And I would definitely recommend others do that. Although the tooling environment is getting better. So it's maybe harder to find little libraries that need to be written.
Yeah, I mean, but even the overall message of marketing yourself especially as a new up-and-coming developer, that makes a lot of sense, right? Developing sort of like your online profile and at least doubling down on the things that you're really, really strong at and making sure that that's front and center when you're developing your profile. Because, I mean, you think of yourself as any professional, there's so much competition in every sector of every industry, especially tech. And, I keep talking about it, but the fact that you were a self-learned developer, I mean, the onus was on you to really prove that you were a better candidate than some of the other more traditionally educated developers. I was just going to ask you about your experience with the smaller companies and then moving into a large company like Facebook. We won't get into specifics, but was that a conscious decision to say, like, I think I'm ready now for everything that sort of comes with a bigger company?
Yeah. Yes, it was. I joined this first small company and I got laid off. I was actually not expecting it. I knew they were going to lay off 3 engineers, and I got 2 out of the 3 correct. Although one of them was on paternity leave, so he was not let go quite yet.
You just didn't know the last one was you.
2 out of 3. That's not bad.
That's not bad.
Yeah, right. So I got let go all of a sudden. I was very surprised by this.
Yeah.
So I think if I had given myself more time to prepare at the time, like, it's possible that I would have made the jump to a big company, or really thought about it. But at that point in time, I just hit up my recruiter, with whom I had worked in the past and who also used to sponsor Rust NYC. But he's since moved upstate and doesn't do that anymore. I'd already been talking to him and sort of softly, getting ready to leave. So I was like, hey, let's ramp this up to 60 miles an hour. And then we started interviewing. And so I ended up at another small company, very good fit. I actually really liked the people there, and I was able to do a lot of really cool stuff. But at the end of that, so I think I stayed at both of these places 1.5 to 2 years, something like that. At the end of that, I think I was seeing, I was starting to feel a little bit less motivated. I think with many companies, what you do is take something out of a database and put it on a web page. And that's fun. There's a lot of great stuff going on there, but like that's, I had been doing that for something like 6 years then. And the extent to which I could motivate myself on the side to keep learning sort of more and more advanced things, it was getting harder and harder to motivate myself to do that. So I think I sort of sensed that I should take a step up in terms of caliber of company. And so I ended up interviewing, and I'm actually really happy that I ended up at Facebook because it challenges me like I've never been challenged before in my life, and I'm happy with that. I think I was sensing that I wanted to join a higher caliber of company at that point in time.
When I found out that you worked at Facebook, I thought of like all of our students who have worked at Facebook. And the one thing that they've consistently said about the interview process is that it is no joke. Like it is a rough interview process. So when I see someone who's an engineer at Facebook, I'm like, you've clearly earned it, because I heard it was pretty tough. And of course, as a company of that caliber, of course it's supposed to be tough. I'm wondering, like, because this is a subject of much debate within at least at Flatiron School with some of our students, especially prospective students, some of them come in a little bit of delusions of grandeur that I'm trying to come learn a new skill set, and I absolutely need to work for Apple, Amazon, Facebook, all these, these kind of bigger companies. And of course that's an option. But on the flip side, I think it's really interesting when people go work for startup companies, smaller companies. Did you feel like working at those smaller companies was necessary as you were developing those skills? Like, did you feel like maybe you had a little bit more room to kind of work with? Or does it feel like at those bigger companies that there's so much support around that maybe your mistakes aren't as highlighted as it would be in like a smaller setting?
Yes. At the smaller companies, the startups, like I definitely had more freedom. And I think that if you are proactive about touching all aspects of the code base and just like adding new features everywhere, touching the front end here, touching the back end here, like fixing build process, like working on how your team collaborates and stuff like that. Like working at a startup is definitely a great opportunity in that sense. I think that you have to be, I guess life is really a choose your own adventure novel. And so maybe anywhere you sort of have to be proactive, but like, yes, that aspect of it is true, that like if you're at a startup, you can really get involved in a lot of different aspects of the code. And that was very helpful. I think that, when I was doing my own thing, I started off by building the front end, and then I was like, now it needs to talk to a back end. So like, let's build a back end. And then I was like, I don't know what to do about the database. Okay, let's learn a little bit about the database. And then, I don't know how to deploy it. And then I don't know about what DNS is. And like, sort of there's this massive world of stuff that you just don't understand. And then like incrementally, piece by piece, you start getting a sense of like what the full stack looks like. And I think that honestly, that's one of the most, that's something that's worked well for me, is sort of understanding the full stack, not in a huge amount of detail or anything like that, but like well enough to sell myself and well enough to have a few side projects that gave me this imprimatur of like that I know what I'm talking about when I say this. Okay, I went off on a tangent. The question was, do startups?
It's a good tangent.
Yeah. Okay, so do startups give you? Is the freedom worth it versus sort of the structure of big companies? I think that it's easy in startups to, I think that there's two things that are really important. One is putting yourself out there and doing a lot of different things. Most people that you work with probably don't know much more than you do on a particular subject if you've spent a little bit of time researching it. Or if they do, then there's like other subjects that people don't know all that much about. And so like nobody, everybody's overworked. So everybody's happy if you take the initiative to fix the, upgrade this library or whatever. So I think that being proactive was very important. And then I also think that it's really important to have good mentors. So I think if somebody is evaluating multiple companies, especially early on, it's, I think, a good idea to ask very explicitly like what the mentorship is like, how much support they'll get and stuff like that, because you don't want to end up at a company where you flounder and nobody cares. And, it's kind of, it's not a very good culture. So I think those are the two aspects of it.
I like that. Yeah. I wanted to shift gears a little bit into your outside of work. It seemed, is it a job technically? You are the meetup organizer for Rust NYC. We've hosted Rust NYC a few times, and even in these times, even in cold weather, the people come out, they support. A really active group, it seems like a real community. Like people recognize folks when they come in, and you guys, it always feels like a real tight-knit group. So I'm curious as to why you started Rust NYC. I'll be honest, when I heard about Rust NYC at first, I don't know. I didn't know what Rust was. I immediately thought of, I don't know why, but I thought of woodshop. I don't know. I was like, why are we partnering with a woodshop company? This feels weird. But maybe a better place to start is with what is Rust and why you ended up starting this meetup, and why Rust is valuable, because I definitely heard your talk on Rust.
Sure. Yeah. So first off, I do really want to thank the Flatiron School for being, I think, one of the few places, the only place that I could find that was hosting in-person meetups. And so that was awesome, because I think I was itching to get Rust NYC meeting again in person. And you guys have been amazing hosts, and the venue is awesome. It's really works well for the size of group that we have. And anyway, just say, you guys have been awesome. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
How did I start Rust NYC? I had tried to learn Rust a little bit and toyed with it on the side. It's a programming language. And then I went to the Meetup group, and for whatever reason, maybe the other organizers were non-responsive or something, but Meetup had like some sort of banner on the page. It was like, hey, do you want to be the organizer? And I clicked yes. And then suddenly I was the organizer. So that's kind of how it happened. So then from then I, organized a few meetups. It took a few months to get the first one. I put in a lot more effort into that first one than I put into subsequent ones, because I had just no idea whether it would work, and enough people showed up. So it was awesome. And over time, I think there's maybe like 8-ish, 10-ish organizers of Rust NYC right now. And depending on everybody's time availability, like they do or don't help organize. And so sometimes we just miss months. That's fine. I would like to be a little bit more professional about it, but I'm also not putting in the effort to be more professional about it. So, okay. So yeah, it's kind of a fun thing that's just run by us, and there's enough people that show up, and places are happy to host us, which is kind of nice. I think also early on, yeah. So that's why and how I organized the Rust NYC meetup. Why Rust? Rust is a really awesome programming language. I think it is one of the few programming languages that helps you learn how to code or conceive of code in a different way. Something like So other ones are like, Haskell or ML or something like that. And these kind of programming or Lisp type languages, these kind of programming languages are maybe have a reputation of being difficult to learn. Rust is not like that difficult, I don't think. But it definitely has a learning curve compared to JavaScript. I think that the main selling point that I would say for Rust, from a learning perspective, is that like if you already know JavaScript, learning Python like doesn't really help you conceive of code in a different way. They fundamentally have the same model. But learning Rust forces you to think about other concepts that are just not present in other programming languages, which has a disadvantage in that you have to think about other things, and an advantage because it means you can write better code or more efficient code or what have you. And then the other advantage of Rust is that it's got a really strong type system. So you can use these high-level constructs that eventually compile into extremely efficient code. And this code can run on the back end. It can run in the browser if you target WebAssembly. And so it's kind of nice. It's like it's a very good language for targeting a bunch of different use cases. And it can be as high level or as low level as you want. Would definitely recommend learning it.
Yeah, I know that you would definitely recommend people learning it, because when I watched your talk, I think you did the talk back in 2019, right before the world changed. And correct me if I'm wrong, in the beginning of your talk, you said Rust could replace JavaScript or should replace JavaScript. Still,
yes.
We're almost in 2022. Are you still claiming that?
Yes, absolutely. I still think it should. It has not yet. You can write code in Rust and have sort of more guarantees about it than you can with JavaScript. That's kind of nice. I think Rust is just a better language. Is a nicer language to write in.
Gotcha.
Namely because the compiler enforces a lot of things. So it's a lot easier to write abstractions that are hard to misuse, which is pretty hard to do in JavaScript. So yes, we'll get there eventually. So yeah.
All right, we'll let them debate it out in the comments below. We'll just have them debate it.
Yes, absolutely.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about when I was in the meetup and I was kind of listening to folks have separate conversations and stuff like that, is that's an incredible networking opportunity for the folks that come to that event. And I'm wondering for you, was that something you had in mind when you, because you're the master marketer of your career. I'm wondering if this was all a plot to obviously promote the Rust programming language that you think will take over, but also as a way to have a built-in community of people that obviously support each other, but obviously you want to grow your career as well. So I'm wondering if that was any of your thought process.
I would have organized Rust NYC whether or not there was a networking aspect to it, but there definitely was a networking aspect to it. Yeah. In particular, that presentation that you referenced that I gave in 2019, actually somebody from Facebook was in the audience, and I was interviewing at Facebook at the time. And so I ended up talking to them, and they ended up being a very big advocate for me behind the scenes. So I think that it's very possible that I wouldn't have received an offer from Facebook if not for the fact that there happened to be somebody in the audience. So that's kind of awesome. I don't really want to, I'm the organizer of Rust NYC, so I don't want to give too many presentations at Rust NYC. It feels a little bit like self-dealing. But once in a while I did, and that time it worked out pretty well. I think it's a pretty good networking opportunity. One of our sponsors was a recruiting company early on, our only sponsor, as far as I know. Maybe from beforehand there were more. And they placed a bunch of people. And for a recruiting company, placing a single person is like, 1/6 of their annual salary in terms of income. So for them, placing several people over the course of a couple of years, like more than pays for all the pizza and beer and whatever. And that just goes to show like sort of the high caliber of engineers that are there. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the people that I met at Rust NYC are now, working on Rust at AWS, using Rust at Amazon and at other like really awesome companies. There are a lot of people from MongoDB were there. And I think Meetup. Well, there were a few people from Meetup. So like, I don't know if they actually use Rust or if they use it on the side. But anyway, there were a number of really good engineers. And so it's kind of awesome to have met a bunch of good engineers through the Meetup. And, yeah, that's a big aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the people that you get to come and talk are great too. They're fantastic. Some of the
thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, the presentations. And a couple of our students actually stayed behind to watch the presentation. And I always feel like it's so, like those type of opportunities are so great to just see the future. That was one of the conversations I had with the students. Like he told me, he's like seeing it up there is like I'm supposed to do that. Like at the end of this program, that's nuts that I'm going to be able to do that. I'm like, that's the future right there. And I love the fact that our students are able to, anyone who's looking for a community to join of people, of like-minded people in tech. I think the Rust NYC group is a great way to really not just network, but really find community. Because I was really, really impressed by the way that, especially like the first, well, actually, no, the second one too. Both of them were pretty packed and pretty high energy. So, yeah, great job sort of building that.
Yeah, I honestly think it's a really great community. And I hope that it stays a strong community. I think the first couple speakers set a really, really high bar. And we'll see whether we can maintain that bar over time. It'll be a challenge, but but more to the point about like whether somebody can achieve that, is whether they can see themselves on stage. This is definitely becoming an engineer is a multi-year endeavor. I think early on, the goal is to get employed, and to be in a job where you have good mentorship or good growth opportunities, and hopefully also a great salary. But like the learning doesn't stop there. Right. So I think that like once you've been in the industry for 5-ish years or longer or less, I don't know, it depends on the person, you start to just have familiarity with more aspects of the code base. And once you have, like I mentioned, that sort of like the understanding of the entire stack, like it becomes easier to start seeing like how these other things fit in, and they stop feeling so distant and magical or intractable.
Yeah. Yeah. On that note, how do you, as a seasoned engineer, like how do you stay sharp, and how would you recommend maybe somebody that's in the program or just graduated the program, how would you sort of advise like new engineers to stay sharp?
I think that most companies that you join, most companies will not have all of the best practice, will not be using all of the best practices. And places like Hacker News and the programming subreddit and other places are really good at disseminating best practices. So whether that's like adding, continuous integration or, like transitioning from JavaScript to TypeScript or what have you, there are likely to be low-hanging fruit at a bunch of places. And so I would definitely recommend looking for that low-hanging fruit and sort of try to, be like the better engineering champion, or push for a few things like that. So early on, there are likely to be obvious things that you can, obvious is the wrong word. There are better engineering things that you can push for in order to grow. I think for me, like I work on Relay, which is a framework for building data-driven React apps that we use at Facebook, and it's also open sourced. And so as soon as I joined Facebook, like the challenges that I was facing were completely different. And I'm challenged by my day-to-day job. So I don't necessarily feel like I need to grow outside of work anymore. I definitely felt like I needed that beforehand, and now absolutely no longer feel that way.
Yeah.
How do let's see, other ways to stay sharp.
Yeah.
I think that the biggest thing that I would say, the most important thing I would say is to have projects and deploy them. So for example, at the end of boot camp, you typically have a capstone project. It looks a lot more impressive to an interviewer if the capstone project isn't just designed by you. Maybe you have a friend who's a designer. Have them look at it and sort of give you tips or make it look more professional. The flip side of this is that people who are judging your resume like aren't going to dive into the code and or at first will take a superficial look at your project. So the superficial things are important. Get the design looking professional and looking good and probably looking pretty standard. Secondly, like deploy it online. It's much more impressive if your project is at least deployed on Heroku, which should be fairly simple to set up. And once it's deployed on Heroku, I would also recommend going through the effort to learn Route 50, Amazon's DNS service, Route 53, to give it an actual URL, like a vanity URL. Once you have those three things, a project that is not necessarily distinguished by its technical merits, like looks a lot better. So more to the point, doing all of these things like is a great way, is it sort of a great way to keep, is a good North Star for like how to keep learning things. Like if you know that if you started out learning the front end, learn a bit of back end, then deploy the back end, then add some continuous integration, then you'll probably learn bash scripting at the same time because you have to figure out how to SSH into your servers, or maybe you learn Kubernetes or something like that. But just like learn at least a little bit, like a little bit of the entire stack, and have some sort of projects. Having a project that's actually deployed and maintained, which in full honesty, I don't have any right now, other than my personal website, but like that doesn't require any maintenance and hasn't been touched in years, so that doesn't count. Having a project that's actually deployed and ideally has users will force you to learn about a lot of different aspects of programming. Right. And I think is probably the best way, at least at first, to orient yourself to like, what else should I learn?
Right. Get your hands dirty, get in there. Yeah. I love it. I love the specificity of the advice too. I love it. That's fantastic.
I mean, it's engineer right there.
Yeah.
Engineers will always be specific.
Yeah. I got two more things I wanted to ask you. This one is this was just a quick one. This is kind of, I don't know. I was thinking about this and I wasn't going to ask you, but we're here now, so I'm going to.
Go for
with it. A degree in math, why not go into data science? Personally, I love data science, so I'm just curious as to why not go into data science?
I think I, in an alternative life, would have been happy as a data scientist. When I was 21, 22, I didn't really know what to do to apply to grad school. And many of the data science jobs do require at least a master's to kind of do the kind of work that I wanted to do. But programming on the other hand, like it's not very credential focused. Like it's very much like if you have the skills, then there's work for you. And so that's why I didn't end up in data science. I like data science. I like it a lot. I mean, my handle is statistics for the win. So like clearly enjoy data science.
Right.
I think that's why. But I think, like to go back to grad school, but will I ever do that? I don't know.
Gotcha.
Probably
Not if you
not.
keep getting challenged at work. I don't think so.
Yes, exactly. I think I'm doing the kind of work that I would otherwise be doing, except I also get paid for it. So that
Right.
I'm very happy with that.
Cool. Just had to get that question
Yeah.
off. And if you can, as much as you can you talk a little bit about like what your day to day looks like now as an engineer in Facebook?
Mm-hmm. So I work on Relay, which is, like I mentioned, a framework for building GraphQL, data-driven React applications that consume GraphQL data. And we're an internal team that maintains the framework and also releases it to open source. So I don't do a lot of product work anymore, but I do support product teams. So there's maybe three aspects of my day-to-day. On the one hand, once in a while, I'm on a call. So this is an interesting situation. Like a lot of different teams use Relay. I have no idea that these tools exist. Sometimes the problem might be in like Oculus VR or something like that. And I'm like, it's kind of hard to debug this, like, so there's a lot of like figuring out how to run different programs, access different tools, and like how to do as little actual work as possible to get to the root of the problem and one, solve it in the future. So future people who are on call don't have to deal with this. And two, sort of just like help the engineer out and unblock them. Okay, so on call is a big aspect of what I do. Although the team is 9-ish engineers, so like it's not that frequent. Secondly, we do planning. So every half, we spend some time figuring out like what are the features that we want to ship in Relay, like what are other teams' needs. There might be other teams that are looking to transition from using some other framework to using Relay, which is like, I mean, obviously we want that. So we will meet with them and discuss like, hey, what is blocking you from using Relay right now? Are there features that we can build that will unblock your use case? Can we support you in other ways? And then most of my day is thankfully doing a lot of feature work. So this half, I spent a lot of time building a better developer experience for updating data in the local Relay database. So when you encounter, when you make a network request, if you're using Relay will sort of keep track of that data for you. And then sometimes when you make a change, you also want to just like imperatively update that data. So instead of updating it on the backend and refetching that data. The existing API to update the data in the database, in the local database, was really clunky and it wasn't type safe. It was really easy to mess up, and just like scanning other people's use of this code base, it was just like obvious that it wasn't a good interface. People were making mistakes left and right. It was not being caught, and these mistakes were making it to production. And so just people didn't know that some aspects of their code was broken, and that's on us for having shipped a bad interface. So most of this half I spent figuring out how we could make that more type safe and more ergonomic. And so how that actually played out. So this ended up being a fairly complicated feature, which involved a lot of different things. And so we spent maybe 2-ish months like actually planning out the feature. So this included writing a 15-page technical document, which I summarized to a 4-page technical document, and to which I summarized to a 1-page technical document, and like constantly meeting with my coworkers, like, okay, like does this actually work in this way? And then it was a lot of work, but I finally got started implementing it, and then the actual implementation is much less work than the planning. I think that if you're on a product team, the opposite might be true. Like you'll do more work implementing and relatively less time planning. But because we're on a framework where so many teams depend on the code that we ship, we have to plan it out very carefully and make sure that because it's hard for us to go back. Once we ship a feature, you can't easily roll it back. If we ship something broken, people will start using that, and we're just now we have to understand product code and fix their product code. And that's not a good situation to be in. So it makes a lot of sense for us to be very, very careful when we ship new features. So there was a lot of planning, and then the implementation, which I've sort of been working on. Thankfully, it's coming. I'm finishing up the implementation, which is awesome because it's just in time for the end of the year. And now I started working with product teams who are willing to be early adopters of this new API to sort of get them excited, explain what's going on before I've written the documentation, tell them hey, there's still these foot guns in the implementation. So be careful, I'll fix this before it's rolled out to all employees. But you have to be aware that here's a way that you can misuse the API, and sort of get them excited, get a sense of where, what's difficult about the API and stuff like that. So all in all, it's pretty well rounded. There's a lot of meeting with other people, planning things. There's a lot of technical implementation. That's a good summary, I think. So.
Got you. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's good to kind of get a sense of what your day to day is like, especially for anyone, kind of demystifying what it's like to be an engineer on the day to day. So I appreciate you breaking it down. I know that we're running up against time, so I wanted to ask the final question, which I ask everyone that comes on the podcast, which is, what is a quote that you personally live by?
Oh,
yeah.
This is not a quote, but I'll give you a maxim, I guess, or an outlook.
Okay.
I think that for the most part, if you get better every single day a little bit, after a few years or a long period of time, you will have leveled up much more than people who are not bettering themselves every day. I guess Bill Gates has a quote that sort of encapsulates this, which is something like, people overestimate how much you can do in a few weeks and underestimate how much you can do over the course of several years. So I think just overall, I always try to be consuming information, whether it's listening to audiobooks or podcasts or reading technical blogs or, pushing myself at work. And I don't necessarily care about optimizing what specifically I'm learning. I do what feels easiest and what feels right, because I know that the pace of learning, no matter what the subject matter is, and the sustainability of that is important. So if I one day feel like learning a lot about, something random, I'll dive into that. And I don't feel guilty about it as long as I am in general bettering myself. And that's not just technical stuff. It's also getting better at, understanding your finances, or understanding how do I use my insurance. I don't know these things. I'm clueless about a lot of things, but I just try on a day to day to get slightly better.
Nice.
That makes me seem like I'm a lot better person than I am, but it's the perk of the format. You can't really. Nobody's here to push back and actually, you're not that. You're not always cracked up to be.
No one's here to counter it, so that it must be true. It must be true. Man, Rob, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. If they wanted to join Rust NYC, where can they go?
So if you Google Rust NYC Meetup, actually, let me see what it's meetup.com/rust-NYC. All are welcome. Our next one, well, this probably won't be up before the next one is, but yeah, all are welcome. And I hope to meet more people.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a fun time, and also thanks for hosting the Rust NYC meetups. Like, you've really made it possible for us to come back, which has just been so awesome.
It's a pleasure, man. It's a pleasure. I'll link it below, Rust NYC, for folks who want to come in person and hear some great talks, meet some great people. It's a fantastic time. Rob, thank you. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And with that, we're out.